Welcome back, Night Owl. I'm glad you're here. Wherever you're listening from, maybe wrapped up in a blanket, maybe resting in the glow of a single lamp, I hope you're ready for something different tonight. Something a little heavier, yet still soothing in its own way. So dim the lights, turn on a fan if you like that low hum in the background. Let your mind go quiet for a while. And as you settle in, feel free to share where you're tuning in from. It's always nice to know who's out there, whispering through the past with me. Tonight, we're not just visiting kings and castles. We're stepping into something darker, into minds unraveling behind crowns of gold, into corridors where power isn't strength, but a slow, spiraling fracture. This is the story of rulers undone from within, men who held the fate of nations in their hands, and then forgot who they were. Let's begin not with war or conquest, but with silence. A cold silence that fell one winter night in Paris, and with it, the slow, haunting unraveling of a king called Beloved, who became something else entirely. Demiso. He was only 11 when the weight of France settled on his slender shoulders. Charles VI, crowned in the twilight glow of a dying century, was the boy who would save a broken kingdom. They called him Charles the Beloved, not just out of duty, but from something genuine. There was warmth in the way the people looked at him, hope even. His father had ruled with a heavy hand, but young Charles had a softness, a brightness in his blue eyes, and a way of moving through court with a chivalrous charm that made hearts lift, if only a little. He rode well, danced often, and threw festivals that sparkled like jewels against the backdrop of post-plague despair. France, torn and aching from the 100 Years' War, dared to believe again. But belief, like a candle, flickers, and on a bitter night in 1393, that flame would gutter. The occasion was a masquerade, a wedding celebration for one of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting, a night of silk, music, and laughter. But also, beneath the masks, something more primal, the kind of tension that lives in the edges of torchlight. Charles and 5 of his young nobles had chosen to dress as wild men, primitive creatures of the forest, shaggy and half-mythical. Their costumes were stitched from linen, soaked in pitch and wax, their bodies tangled with flax to mimic fur. They danced in a strange, frenetic circle, beasts of the old world capering through a room of silk-clad nobility. And then a flicker. The king's brother Louis, late to the revelry, entered the hall holding a torch. Perhaps he meant to join the fun. Perhaps he didn't think. But fire and wax. In a blink, the wild men were flames. The room erupted. Screams, crashing goblets, women fainting. The dancers were swallowed in fire. They ran, their bodies alight, their howls cutting through music that still played absurdly in the background. The Duchess of Berry, quick-thinking and brave, threw her heavy cloak over the king. It saved him. 4 others were not so lucky. Their deaths were slow, agonizing. One clung to life for days, his skin a ruin. The court called it the Bal des Ardents, the Ball of the Burning Men. France whispered behind silk fans and closed doors. Something had cracked that night. And Charles, he was never the same. At first it was subtle, a vacant look. Long silences, moments where the young king seemed not quite present. But grief makes strange shadows in the mind. They waited, hoped, and then came the forest. Riding through the woods on a summer day, Charles suddenly turned on his own escort. Sword drawn, eyes wide and unseeing, he screamed that they were traitors, that they meant to kill him. He attacked, striking down his own men until he was restrained, frothing and wild. He did not remember it. In time, the episodes deepened. He forgot names, then faces, then his own identity. He insisted he was made of glass, fragile, invisible, easily shattered. Servants were forbidden to touch him. He stood still for hours, fearing any movement might break him. He barked like a dog, howled like a wolf. At times he ran howling naked through the palace corridors, hair tangled, nails claw-like. He refused to bathe, refused to change his robes, which became nests for vermin. One day he declared himself St. George, savior of the realm. He ordered royal arms to be altered. No one dared contradict him. When he was lucid, he wept. He knew something was wrong, knew that the kingdom, his family, Even his own thoughts were slipping through his fingers. But the lucidity never lasted. And while he drifted, the court turned inward, like a wounded animal chewing its own limbs. His uncles, his brother, his wife, everyone with blood in their veins and ambition in their heart began to maneuver. France, leaderless, became a chessboard where pawns wore crowns and knights betrayed kings. The Burgundians, the Armagnacs, rival factions clawed at the throne. One controlled it by day, another by night. The boy who had once been beloved became a figurehead, propped up, paraded, hidden when necessary, a king in name only. Meanwhile, across the Channel, England watched, waited, and struck. The 100 Years' War reignited, fiercer than before. Towns burned, borders blurred, and Charles, the once vibrant, golden-haired youth, wandered the halls of his palace, often alone. Once, during a rare moment of clarity, he recognized a knight, an old friend. Tears welled in the king's eyes. "Why have you come?" he asked. "To see you, my king," the knight replied. "It has been long." Charles embraced him, held him like a brother. "Then stay," he said softly. "Stay with me. You are welcome." But the moment passed, the fog returned, and with it the loneliness. The years went on, and France began to forget how it felt to have a ruler who could truly rule. Children were born and grew up never knowing a sane monarch. Their loyalties shifted from kings to warlords. And Charles, broken, shivering, unshaven, lived on. In the winter of 1422, he succumbed to dysentery. By then, no one called him the Beloved. He was Charles the Mad. His son, Charles VII, had already begun to rule in his place. What remained was not just a broken king, but a kingdom in pieces. All because the mind of one man, once filled with promise, had shattered like glass in the cold. And when power rests in the mind alone, what happens when that mind falls apart? Let's stay in that silence a little longer. Across the Channel, a child is born. His name will be Henry, and he too will wear the crown too soon. And he too will slowly disappear. He was gone, not dead, not exiled, not dethroned, but vanished all the same. One morning in 1453, the king simply ceased to respond. He did not rise, he did not speak. He did not recognize his queen, Margaret, nor the cries of their newborn son. His eyes were open, but no one was home. It was as if some vital light inside him had been quietly extinguished, and all that remained was a fragile vessel, a body that moved, but did not live. The court didn't say the word out loud, not at first. Madness. It still held a special kind of terror in the 15th century, not the madness of rage or passion, but of unbeing, of vacancy, a soul unseated. For nearly a year, Henry VI existed in this eerie trance, and the royal court moved around him like mourners at a living funeral. They whispered, they waited, they plotted, because someone had to rule. And in the vacuum, ambition bloomed. Richard, Duke of York, saw his moment. He was no stranger to royal blood, nor to resentment. For years he'd been sidelined while Queen Margaret and her allies controlled the crown through Henry's passive hand. Now, with the king inert and unseeing, Richard stepped forward to be named Lord Protector, the guardian of the realm. It was a cold maneuver, but also a necessary one. Or so he claimed. He summoned Parliament. He arranged the court. He walked the halls like a man who had been practicing for this role all his life. And then after 17 silent months, Henry stirred. The first sign was small, a blink, a shift of the eyes. He turned toward a voice and seemed to hear it. The court froze. Physicians rushed in. The queen, long exiled from his mind, stood at his side with trembling hands. And then, incredibly, Henry spoke. He asked after his wife. He asked after his son. He asked why the chamber felt so cold. The people rejoiced. A miracle, they said. God had restored their king. But it was not a return. It was a flicker, a dying candle caught in the wind. And Henry, even in lucidity, was not what he had been. His thoughts came slowly. His gaze often wandered. His will had weakened. And around him, the court had changed, hardened, grown brittle in his absence. Queen Margaret seized this moment like a hawk. She demanded that Henry reclaim the throne not only in name, but in full authority. Richard of York, who had governed in his stead, was dismissed. Enemies of the Queen were cast out or arrested. Margaret was no longer content to be consort. She would be regent in all but title. The kingdom, she believed, belonged to her son, and she would shape it for him with fire if she had to. But England was not ready to be ruled by a woman with steel in her veins and vengeance in her heart. The nobility split, some clinging to the weak flame of Henry's legitimacy, others rallying behind York, who promised order, strength, and a return to reason. And so war came. The Wars of the Roses, a beautiful name for such a savage thing, began in the blood-soaked fields of St. Albans in 1455. What started as a clash of factions spiraled into a civil war that would tear England in two. Through it all, Henry stood like a ghost. He was present at St. Albans when the fighting broke out. Present, but powerless. As the battle raged around him, he was found under a tree, humming a psalm to himself, the sword in his hand untouched. The stories say he didn't flinch at the sound of battle, that he smiled faintly as blood spilled across the grass. Perhaps he believed God would sort the just from the wicked, or perhaps he no longer understood the meaning of war. For a time, the tide shifted toward York. In 1460, after a string of victories, Richard forced Parliament to name him heir to the throne, disinheriting Henry's young son, Edward of Westminster. It was a bold, brutal stroke. Margaret was outraged. Her son's future, his very identity, had been stolen. She fled to the north, gathered forces, called in favors, and swore that her child would not be denied his birthright. The war resumed, fiercer than before. In December of that same year, Richard of York was killed at Wakefield, his head displayed on the gates of York wearing a paper crown. But his death did not end the Yorkist cause. It only passed the torch to his son, Edward. Not the child Henry's son was, but a tall, charismatic warrior, barely 18, who spoke with fire and struck like thunder. Edward Plantagenet raised an army and swept south. He entered London in 1461, crowned himself Edward IV, and declared Henry unfit to rule. Once again, Henry vanished. He and Margaret fled into the wilderness, wandering through northern strongholds, hiding in monasteries, seeking shelter from allies who were dwindling by the day. Margaret, ever the iron behind the silk, continued to plot. Henry did not. He was a man adrift. Reports from the time speak of him walking through forests barefoot, lost in prayer, of being led by hand, silent, as his wife negotiated for his safety, of sitting for hours by streams, dropping pebbles into the water and watching the ripples with the rapture of a child. 1465, he was captured again, betrayed by those he thought loyal. They brought him back to London, shaved his head, draped him in black, and paraded him through the streets like a trophy. The same king who had once been cradled in golden robes at his coronation now shuffled through mud, flanked by jeering crowds and indifferent soldiers. They locked him in the Tower. This time the silence was not his choice. For 6 years he remained imprisoned. His cell was cold, the walls damp, but he never complained. The guards said he spent his days in prayer, writing psalms on scraps of cloth. Sometimes he spoke to birds through the window, sometimes he spoke to no one. Outside, Edward IV ruled. England seemed to calm, but the roots of conflict remained. And in 1470 they burst through the soil once more. The exiled Margaret returned, leading a rebellion that shook the court. Astonishingly, Henry was released, crowned again. But it was a ghost that wore the crown. He stood in Westminster, draped in ermine, his eyes distant, his words barely audible. No one truly believed he ruled. Margaret and her allies moved the levers behind the curtain, and Edward IV, driven from his throne, vowed revenge. He returned in 1471. The battles were brutal. At Tewkesbury, Margaret's forces were crushed. Her son, the boy for whom she had sacrificed everything, was killed in the chaos. Legend says he was dragged before Edward and struck down on the spot. When news reached Henry in the Tower, he did not cry. He did not speak. That night they came for him. And by morning, Henry VI, the king who loved peace, who cherished learning, who saw visions of saints and shadows, was dead. Some say it was grief. Others say it was a dagger. The chroniclers wrote carefully. The official story said natural causes, but natural causes rarely leave blood behind, and so ended the life of the last Lancastrian king, not with a roar, but with a whisper. A man too gentle for the age he lived in, too fragile for the crown he bore, too human to survive the wolves around him. And perhaps that's the real tragedy. Not that Henry died, but that the world could not make room for a king who did not wish to rule by fear. Thank you for waiting, Night Owl. If your room isn't already dim, this might be the time to soften the light. Let the hush settle in. Maybe turn on a quiet fan. Let it hum beside you like distant winds over moorland. And if your eyes are already growing heavy, that's okay too. This story will carry you gently through the shadows of the past, because tonight we leave the sorrowful stillness of Henry VI behind and descend into a darker, stranger chapter. Not all mad kings were gentle. Some wore their crowns like hammers. Others shattered under the weight and took their kingdoms with them. Now let us step back in time to the heart of the Holy Roman Empire, to the lands of Bohemia, to a man who believed the world had turned against him and set it on fire in return. Wenceslaus IV was crowned King of Bohemia in 1378, inheriting a land rich with learning, culture, and the cautious glow of early Renaissance thought. He was intelligent, some even called him brilliant, and had been groomed for greatness by his father, the mighty Emperor Charles IV. But brilliance is a flame that consumes as easily as it warms, and in Wenceslaus that flame burned uneven. His moods were unpredictable. He could be dazzlingly charming one moment, then descend into silence or fury the next. He drank too much, heavy wines from the Rhine, poured without restraint, and whispered often of betrayal. His mind flickered like candlelight. At first the nobles humored him. He was young, his father's son. A little wild, perhaps, he would grow into the crown. But years passed, and the king grew stranger. He ignored matters of state, often refusing to attend council for weeks at a time. Letters from Rome went unanswered. Laws were left unsigned. Petitions gathered dust on the cold marble floors of Prague Castle. Instead, Wenceslaus withdrew into hunting lodges deep in the forest. Wild, remote places where the trees pressed close and the world faded to silence. It was said that he hunted not just deer and boar, but phantoms of his own mind. He spoke of voices in the leaves, of spies hidden in the birdsong, of plots growing beneath the roots of trees. When courtiers visited him there, they returned pale and shaken. The king no longer spoke in the tongue of politics, but in riddles and accusations. He began carrying an axe, not just on hunts but everywhere, into court, into bedchambers, into the chapel. He would polish it obsessively, even during meetings, his eyes flickering with thoughts he never said aloud. In time, the court began to fear him, not just for his volatility, but for his cruelty. He had once been called the king of the people, generous, even tender-hearted in his youth. But something inside had shifted. Perhaps it was pressure, perhaps grief, perhaps madness bloomed quietly, like mold in damp stone. Whatever the cause, Wenceslaus began to punish those who displeased him in ways that chilled even his hardened advisors. A minor noble who questioned his tax laws was summoned to the palace and returned home days later, missing 2 fingers. A priest who dared to criticize the king in sermon was thrown into the Vltava River, with stones tied to his feet. And worst of all, in the summer of 1393, Wenceslaus ordered the torture and execution of John of Nepomuk, a beloved cleric and confidant of the queen, for refusing to betray her confessions. The court was horrified, the people outraged. John was thrown from the Charles Bridge under moonlight, his body left to float beneath the castle's reflection. That moment shattered what little trust remained. Whispers turned to roars. The nobility rose, led by Wenceslaus's own brother, Sigismund. A rebellion tore through the heart of Bohemia. Armored knights stormed the castle gates in the dead of night. Wenceslaus was seized, imprisoned, humiliated, his axe taken from him, his crown set aside. He was no longer king in anything but name, and yet Bohemia could not let him go completely. Despite his madness, despite his tyranny, despite the blood on his hands, there was no true alternative. Sigismund's rule proved no less chaotic. The empire began to fracture. In Rome, the Great Schism split the church in two. Europe itself seemed to teeter on the edge. So Wenceslaus was released, returned to the throne. A broken man, yes, but still a king. In his later years, he became a shadow of himself. He drank more than ever, his mind rotting beneath layers of wine and paranoia. His once sharp gaze became dull, his words slurred, his hands trembling. But in those rare moments of clarity, he still seemed to know what he had lost. There is a story told by a chambermaid, a quiet one, unnoticed by the chroniclers. One evening, she found him sitting in the chapel alone, staring at the altar. No guards, no courtiers, just the king and the flickering light of a single candle. He turned to her and said, "Tell me, girl, when I die, will they say I was mad or evil?" She didn't know what to say. She bowed and left. He never asked again. Wenceslaus died in 1419, alone in his lodge, surrounded by silence and empty goblets. No grand procession, no tears in the street, just the quiet passing of a man once born for greatness, undone by a kingdom he could not control, and a mind that could not be tamed. In Bohemia, he is remembered with complexity. To some, he was a tyrant. To others, a martyr of madness. But always a warning. Because not all mad kings fall quietly. Some burn the world on their way down. And when they do, history doesn't ask why. It simply writes their names in blood and shadow. You're still here, Night Owl. Still wandering with me through these crumbling castles, these haunted corridors of time. And I'm glad. Let the hush deepen around you. Maybe stretch your legs beneath the blanket. Shift the pillows just right. Let the world outside drift away. Because where we're going now, it's all whispers and wait. Tonight, we leave the forests of Bohemia behind and cross the cold North Sea. To a kingdom of rain and stone. To the jagged edges of Scotland. And to a king whose rage ran deeper than madness. A man whose mind was a battlefield, but whose heart bled for a crown he could never truly hold. James Roy of Scotland, born in 1394, during a time of bitter wars and fragile peace. James was a child of chaos before he ever held a scepter. When he was just 12 years old, his family, fearing for his life in a land torn apart by clan feuds and assassinations, placed him on a ship bound for France, a safe passage that never reached its shore. The English intercepted the vessel. The young Scottish prince was taken captive, and thus began 18 long years of imprisonment, 18 winters, 18 summers, locked away in the Tower of London and later in Windsor. Imagine that. A boy watching manhood pass him by, pacing in stone rooms, fed by guards who looked at him with equal parts fear and disdain. He read, he wrote, he learned languages, studied poetry and governance. They called him a scholar, a gentleman, even a poet. But inside, something hardened. Not just the longing for home, but the rage, the betrayal. 'Cause while James rotted in foreign chains, his kingdom, his blood did nothing. The Scottish nobles grew fat on his absence, warring and scheming, enjoying their power without a king to answer to. They had abandoned him. When James finally returned to Scotland in 1424, no longer a boy but a stern-faced man of 30, his smile was tight and his eyes cold. He had come to take back what was his, and he would do it with iron. From the moment of his coronation, James ruled not with mercy, but with vengeance. He sought to crush the fractious clans that had torn his country apart, to break the nobles who had ruled like kings in his absence, and he did. One by one, he hunted them down. He confiscated lands, imprisoned lords, beheaded those who defied him. His justice was swift and cruel. One noble, Walter Stewart, the Duke of Albany, had ruled in James's place for years. Within months of James's return, he and his entire family were seized, tried, and executed, their heads displayed on spikes. The message was clear. The king was home, and he would not forgive. But power gained through fear leaves only silence behind. Though the people feared him, few truly loved him. Though the court bowed low, behind their hands they whispered. James kept building walls. More guards, more laws, more punishments. He was brilliant, yes. Scotland had not seen such a mind in decades. He reorganized the treasury, reformed justice, even introduced music and poetry into court life. But his brilliance was not enough, because the fear never left him. The boy who had grown up in captivity never truly felt safe, and so he watched, and listened, and punished. They say he wandered the halls at night barefoot, listening for voices that spoke too low. They say he grew obsessed with betrayal, saw daggers in the smiles of his advisors, poison in every goblet of wine. He would test his courtiers constantly, asking riddles, probing for loyalty like a surgeon testing wounds. Then, it happened. A real conspiracy. Not imagined. Not whispered by ghosts. Real steel, real men. A plot that reached deep into the court, even into his own household. In February of 1437, James was staying at the Blackfriars Monastery in Perth with his queen, Joan Beaufort. The snow outside had frozen thick upon the ground. Inside, the walls were warm, the hearths glowing. Should have been safe, but his enemies came with keys. Led by Sir Robert Graham and allies from the old Albany faction, they stormed the monastery late in the night, slipping past the guards who had been bribed or butchered. James heard them. He knew. The stories say he tried to flee through the privy chamber, only to discover the sewer tunnel he once used had been sealed shut. By his own orders, ironically, to prevent tennis balls from being lost during games. Imagine that. King trapped by his own walls. He fought, desperately, barefoot on the cold stone. He seized a fireplace poker and struck down one of the attackers, shouting for help, bleeding and furious. But they overwhelmed him. 28 stab wounds. By the time the Queen's guards reached him, it was too late. James died in the flicker of torchlight, surrounded not by courtiers or counselors, but traitors, shadows, and the sound of his own heartbeat fading on the stones. The Queen would later avenge him, hunting down his killers with a fury that scorched the land. But James's reign ended as it had begun. In betrayal, history remembers him with unease. A poet king, a scholar, a reformer, and a man who ruled with fists clenched so tightly around his crown, he crushed both his enemies and himself. His life was a cage and made of stone, of memory, of fear. And though he broke free from England's chains, he never escaped the ones he forged in his own mind. The mind of a king is a dangerous place, especially when no one dares to enter your still with me, night owl. Still drifting through the flicker and fog of forgotten monarchs. And there are more waiting in the dark, kings who raged, kings who wept, and kings who simply vanished. But that is for tomorrow night. You're back, still with me under this quiet hush, where the night carries old secrets like falling ash. It means something, that you're still listening, still wandering the crumbling corridors of power with me. If your room's a little chilly, maybe pull the blanket closer to your chin, or turn on a fan for that soft hum, something to stir the silence while the story unfolds. And if you haven't already, tell me where you're listening from. I'd love to know where in the world these echoes are reaching. Because tonight we walk the icy stones of Sweden, through snowbound forests and candlelit chambers, into the heart of a ruler known not for cruelty, but for something stranger. A mind split, a life unraveling, a queen crowned in golden triumph, and dethroned in whispers. Queen Christina of Sweden. She was born in 1626, into the shadow of greatness. Her father, King Gustavus Adolphus, was a titan of war, a Protestant hero, lionized across Europe. When he died in battle, Christina was just 6 years old. The court mourned the king, but a strange sort of wonder passed through Sweden's noble circles when the child appeared. Not sobbing or frightened, but calm, poised, watching. She was crowned heir to the throne, raised like a prince. And from the beginning, there was something otherworldly about her. She dressed in men's clothing. She shunned the company of women. She studied Latin, Greek, philosophy, astronomy. Her appetite for knowledge was ferocious, endless. She read Descartes. She invited scholars from across Europe to her court. She filled her palace with books, instruments, maps, and debates. And yet, the deeper she reached for knowledge, the more distant she seemed to grow from the people she ruled. Christina walked like a soldier, spoke with the boldness of a man in an age that didn't know what to do, with a woman who refused softness. Her laughter was rare, her eyes sharp. She hated the stiffness of royal ceremony, the endless rituals, the velvet cages of queenship. Sweden had crowned her, but she had never truly belonged to the throne. She belonged to something else, a fever of the soul, a search for meaning in a world where every answer just birthed another question. Her court grew uneasy. The nobles whispered, She refuses marriage. She will not bear an heir. She surrounds herself with foreign philosophers and strange artists, and stranger still. She had dreams. Dreams that she was meant for something more than the crown. They called her eccentric, then erratic, then unstable. By the time she reached her late 20s, the pressure had become unbearable. Sweden needed an heir. The council pushed her to wed, to settle, to become what they needed, not what she was. But Christina would not be tamed. In 1654, she shocked Europe. She summoned her court. Dressed in solemn black, she entered the great hall. And before them all, she abdicated the throne. A queen no more. Her cousin would become king. The kingdom would move on. But Christina vanished into legend. She traveled across Europe in secret, in disguise. She shed her identity like old skin, leaving behind Christina of Sweden and becoming something stranger. A seeker, a wanderer, a soul in exile, and then one final scandal. She converted to Catholicism. The Protestant queen, the symbol of Sweden's Lutheran pride, renounced her faith and embraced the Church of Rome. In Rome, she was received like an empress reborn. But her reputation followed her like smoke. Some called her brilliant. Some called her mad. She lived in a palazzo, funded by the Pope, where she hosted salons of artists and thinkers, and where the furniture was rumored to be rearranged every night in a manic haze. She never married, never ruled again. She died in 1689 in relative obscurity, but Christina's story lingers, in paintings, in books, in the silence that surrounds her legacy. Was she a woman broken by the burden of monarchy? Or was she free in a way no ruler ever dared to be? Was she mad? Or just untamed? The truth, like so much of her life, is a mirror fogged with breath. We can see the outline, but never the full shape. What we know is this: there once was a queen who walked away, not because she failed the crown, but because the crown failed her. And in a world ruled by men, she burned her own path across the snow. Still with me, Night Owl? There's more. Always more. The past is full of shadows, and some of them are still whispering. We go next to a palace that glittered like a dream, and a man who thought he was building paradise. But in the end, he built his tomb. You're still here, still awake in the hush between midnight thoughts and memories that don't belong to us, but feel like they do. It's good to have you. If the night feels a little heavy, that's all right. Let it press gently. Let the silence settle into your bones. Maybe light a candle, or just breathe in the stillness. This isn't just a story. It's a descent, a soft fall into a world of mirrors and illusions. Tonight, we walk through marble halls where time stands still, where moonlight touches gold, and beauty wraps around madness like ivy. Ludwig II of Bavaria, the Swan King, the Dream King, a monarch whose heart beat not for power, but for music, solitude, and impossible dreams. He built castles like operas. He crowned himself in fantasy, and he drowned in the silence of his own mind. Ludwig was born in 1845, in a Bavaria caught between Old World romance and New World change. He was shy, withdrawn, a boy who preferred poetry to politics, moonlit walks to military drills. He hated public life. He hated court. But when his father died suddenly in 1864, Ludwig became king at just 18, and the crown was no lighter for its beauty. He tried at first, tried to govern, to attend councils, to be what the world demanded, but the court whispered, "He's strange. He won't marry. He reads too much, stares too long, doesn't listen." So Ludwig turned away from them and built a kingdom of his own. He poured his soul into architecture, into myth, into a world that never was. He became obsessed with Richard Wagner, the composer of sweeping operas and ancient legends. Wagner's music lit something inside Ludwig, a fire, a vision. He summoned the composer to his court, lavished him with gifts and funding. He imagined a Bavaria steeped in medieval romance, ruled not by politics but by beauty and divine right. And so began the castles. Neuschwanstein, his most famous, rises like a dream from the Alps, its white towers piercing the mist. Inside, every room a masterpiece, a cathedral to music, murals of swan knights, kings of old, and lonely heroes seeking redemption. Hallways echo with silence. Balconies face endless mountain air. He built more, Linderhof, Herrenchiemsee, each more lavish, more isolated. And Ludwig. Ludwig stopped attending government meetings, stopped appearing in public. He became a phantom king, writing letters in the dead of night, summoning servants only when the moon was full. He ate alone, rode in sleighs by starlight. He spoke to ghosts, to legends, to gods of his own making. The court was scandalized. He spent enormous sums from the royal treasury, bankrupting the crown, they said. He built while his ministers begged for his attention. He funded opera while his people starved in the countryside. But Ludwig didn't hear them, or didn't care. He wasn't building a kingdom for the living. He was building a dream that would outlive him. Sanctuary from the ugliness of power. But even dreams have their limits. By 1886, the Bavarian government could take no more. They declared Ludwig insane. A panel of doctors, none of whom had examined him in person, signed a declaration. And so they came for him. On June 10th, Ludwig was arrested in Neuschwanstein, his beloved castle. He went quietly, too quietly. 2 days later, he was dead. They say he went for a walk with his doctor on the shores of Lake Starnberg, and they both drowned. No one saw what happened. No one heard a struggle. The water held its secrets. Ludwig's body was found with no signs of panic. His watch stopped at 6:54 p.m. The doctor's body floated nearby. Some believe Ludwig jumped. Others suspect darker truths. But maybe he didn't die that night. Maybe he just slipped deeper into the world he had always belonged to. The world of swan nights, of cursed kings, of castles in clouds. Today, millions walk through Neuschwanstein and gasp at its beauty. But the rooms are cold, empty. Frozen in the moment, Ludwig stepped away. What is madness in a world so cruel? Was he mad? Or was he just refusing to wake up? He once said, "I want to remain an eternal enigma to myself and to others." And he did. A man who loved the stars more than thrones, who built a kingdom no army could conquer, and who vanished into a lake wrapped in silence. You're still with me, Night Owl, still drifting through broken crowns and whispered names. But don't sleep yet, because our next tale is darker still. Not of a king who escaped the world, but of one who tried to remake it in his own image. A man whose hunger for control left a trail of ruin behind him. Tomorrow, we go to Russia. You're back, still walking through the dark with me. That means something, because tonight's story isn't just about power. It's about the cost of carrying it in your blood. So find a quiet place, let the silence settle, and if you haven't already, dim the lights. Maybe let a fan hum nearby, something to anchor you in this world. Because we're about to step into another, a world of velvet and stone, of paintings that never blink, and halls where history breathes through cracked plaster. We're going to Spain now, to meet a king born into majesty, and destined to crumble beneath it, Charles II of Spain. They called him El Hechizado, the Bewitched, and some believed he truly was. Born in 1661, Charles entered the world broken. He was the last of the Habsburgs, a dynasty that had married cousins to cousins for centuries, until their bloodlines twisted in on themselves like vines choking a tree. His tongue was too large for his mouth. His jaw jutted so severely he couldn't chew. He didn't speak until he was 4, didn't walk until he was 8. Behind palace walls, his caretakers whispered prayers over his cradle. Was it a curse, a punishment, a divine joke? The king-in-waiting looked less like a ruler and more like a fragile doll, pale, frail, with a gaze that flickered between childlike confusion and something darker, like he knew somehow that his body was a battlefield. His mother, Mariana of Austria, ruled in his name for years. She was devout, controlling, desperate. She ordered endless exorcisms, convinced her son was under the spell of witches. Priests read Latin over his fevered body. Holy relics were laid on his chest. He screamed in his sleep. And still he grew. Into a man. King in name, but not in strength. He tried, God knows he tried, to play the part. But every decision slipped through his fingers. Every war ended in disaster. Every treaty signed with trembling hands. The court was a nest of vultures. Ministers came and went, each more corrupt than the last. And Charles, poor, confused Charles, floated through it all like a ghost in his own life. His body ached constantly. His limbs refused to obey. He would forget where he was mid-conversation, staring into the distance as if haunted by something no one else could see. Sometimes he spoke in riddles, other times not at all. He married twice, once to Marie Louise of Orléans, a French princess who arrived at court full of hope and horror. She wrote home of how miserable she was, how lonely. The king couldn't father a child. He couldn't lead a kingdom. He barely seemed to live. When Marie Louise died suddenly, possibly poisoned, though no proof was ever found, Charles wept for days, and then remarried. Maria Anna of Neuburg. She came from Germany, bringing superstition and suspicion in equal measure. She too bore him no heir, and the whispers grew louder. The Spanish court believed there was black magic at work. They brought in more exorcists, more rituals. They bathed him in holy water, made him drink sacred oils, forced him to sleep with relics beneath his bed. He begged for salvation, but it never came. His body wasted away. By his late 30s, an age when kings should be at their peak, he was a shadow. His skin pale and papery, his teeth rotted, his mind slipping further with each season. And yet he remained king, because no one else could be, because the Habsburg line rested on him. This trembling, tragic figure. Toward the end, he obsessed over death. He would stare at coffins, touch bones, demand to see the body of his first wife, Marie Louise, exhumed from her grave. When they opened the casket, Charles wept, not for love, perhaps, but for everything he could never hold. In his final months, he could barely speak. He signed decrees with shaking hands, surrounded by opportunists and foreign agents. France and Austria circled like wolves, waiting for his last breath to divide the carcass of Spain. On November 1st, 1700, Charles II died. He was just 38. His death ended the Spanish Habsburg line, a dynasty that had ruled for centuries, undone by centuries of intermarriage and delusion. The autopsy was grim. His body, they said, contained nothing but rot and ruin. His heart was the size of a peppercorn, his intestines gangrenous, his head full of fluid, and yet he had lived, somehow, for nearly 4 decades. What kind of will is that? What kind of curse? Charles II wasn't wicked. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't mad like Ivan or visionary like Ludwig. He was something worse. He was powerless, trapped in a body that couldn't serve him, in a kingdom he couldn't rule, under a weight he never asked to bear. And when he died, Spain fractured, Europe erupted into war, and the dynasty that had once ruled the world became a cautionary tale whispered in dark corridors. You still with me, Night Owl? Still breathing in the dark? 'Cause next we go north, where another broken king would trade his crown for silent scandal and one last desperate escape into the unknown. You're still here, still drifting through the corridors of the past with me. That means you're not afraid of the dark anymore. Or maybe you are, and that's why you stay. Maybe the quiet helps, the hush between each word, the way stories wrap around your thoughts like smoke curling through an open window. Wherever you are, sitting cross-legged in bed, walking alone at night, or listening under dim lights on a long drive, breathe in, feel the centuries settle around you. Because tonight we travel to Sweden, to a king who walked away from his crown, who traded empire for exile, and whose heart, they say, was broken long before he let the world see it. This is the story of Queen Christina of Sweden. Yes, Queen. But her name belongs here, among the tyrants and tortured souls, because Christina's rule defied every expectation, and her fall echoed through Europe like a sudden storm. She was born in 1626 to King Gustavus Adolphus, the Lion of the North, a towering figure of Protestant power. But Christina's arrival was anything but simple. She was declared a boy at birth. The midwives, startled by her muscular cries and strong features, assumed she must be male. When the mistake was corrected, her father famously declared, "She shall be as good as any boy." And so she was raised like one, taught politics, strategy, languages, and war, dressed in breeches, rode horses, trained with weapons. From an early age, Christina knew she was being shaped into something unnatural, not by choice, but by necessity. You're still here, still drifting through the corridors of the past with me. That means you're not afraid of the dark anymore. Or maybe you are, and that's why you stay. Maybe the quiet helps, the hush between each word, the way stories wrap around your thoughts like smoke curling through an open window. Wherever you are, sitting cross-legged in bed, walking alone at night, or listening under dim lights on a long drive, breathe in, feel the centuries settle around you. Because tonight we travel to Sweden, to a king who walked away from his crown, who traded empire for exile, and whose heart, they say, was broken long before he let the world see it. This is the story of Queen Christina of Sweden. Yes, Queen. But her name belongs here, among the tyrants and tortured souls, because Christina's rule defied every expectation, and her fall echoed through Europe like a sudden storm. She was born in 1626 to King Gustavus Adolphus, the Lion of the North, a towering figure of Protestant power. But Christina's arrival was anything but simple. She was declared a boy at birth. The midwives, startled by her muscular cries and strong features, assumed she must be male. When the mistake was corrected, her father famously declared, "She shall be as good as any boy." And so she was raised like one, taught politics, strategy, languages, and war, dressed in breeches, rode horses, trained with weapons. From an early age, Christina knew she was being shaped into something unnatural, not by choice, but by necessity. Next, we descend into the mind of a man who ruled an empire from the edge of madness and never found his way back. You're still with me, in the stillness, where the only thing louder than silence is memory. Funny how the past has a way of clinging to the corners of a quiet room, isn't it? Like old wallpaper you never quite tore down. If you're just joining now, welcome. But if you've been here a while, then you know the rhythm. The weight of centuries pressing down like fog. Stories not shouted but whispered. So maybe turn down the lights a little more. Lie back. Let your breath match the pace of the tale. Because this next chapter takes us into marble corridors and candlelit madness, to Vienna, and to the long, slow unraveling of Emperor Ferdinand IV of Austria. He was born in 1793, into a world of empire and etiquette, war and diplomacy, a time when monarchs didn't just govern, they embodied power. And yet, from the beginning, Ferdinand was a contradiction. His head was too large for his body, his limbs slow to move, his speech broken by long pauses and stuttering bursts. Doctors called it hydrocephalus, water on the brain. But in the court, they didn't call it anything. 'Cause what do you do when your heir is sick? When the bloodline you've nurtured for generations produces a child who cannot hold a pen, let alone a scepter? You hide it. You train him. You pray. Ferdinand's tutors tried everything. They drilled him in Latin and politics, in military command and court etiquette. But he couldn't focus, couldn't remember, couldn't follow the weight of royal instruction without drifting off or shaking uncontrollably. He suffered from epilepsy, the kind that strikes without mercy. Seizures that would leave him collapsed on the marble floors of the Hofburg Palace. Sometimes they came in clusters, dozens in a single day. They tried to make a king out of him anyway. In 1835, after the death of his father, Ferdinand was crowned Emperor of Austria. He wore the robes, held the orb and scepter, recited the oaths. But behind the scenes, the real decisions were made by a shadowy triumvirate. His uncle Archduke Ludwig, his mother Caroline Augusta, and the powerful Chancellor Prince Metternich. They treated Ferdinand like a porcelain relic, adorned, protected, but never trusted, never allowed to stand alone. And Ferdinand, he knew. He felt the invisible hands guiding every moment of his reign. He once tried to sign a decree abolishing executions. They took the paper from his hands. He didn't resist. He just nodded. Ja, vielleicht morgen. Yes, maybe tomorrow. There's a sadness in that, isn't there? A man too kind, too broken to fight, yet still wearing the weight of nations on his shoulders. He was married to Maria Anna of Sardinia. The marriage was arranged, of course. The union was childless, but not for lack of trying. When pressed by doctors on why the marriage remained unconsummated, Ferdinand replied, "I'm not sure. Is it allowed to do it with the Empress?" His innocence or confusion became legend. Courtiers whispered jokes behind fans and drapes, but others pitied him. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't ambitious. He simply was. A gentle soul placed on the sharpest of thrones. Then came 1848, the year the world burned. Revolution swept through Europe like wildfire. France, Germany, Italy, Hungary. People rose up against kings, against systems, against centuries. And Vienna? It erupted. Students flooded the streets. Workers formed militias. The people demanded freedom, reform, a new age. And Ferdinand? He stood at the windows of the palace, watching the fires glow in the distance. His advisors panicked. His generals plotted. But the emperor, the fragile man they'd hidden behind velvet curtains, just looked at the flames and said, "Well, I suppose it's time to go." And he abdicated. He gave the empire to his young nephew, Franz Joseph, packed his things, and left. Just like that. He retired to Prague, not in disgrace, not in madness, just in peace. And there, in a quiet castle overlooking the Vltava River, he lived another 27 years. He tended to his garden, fed his pigeons, watched the seasons change. They say he'd walk slowly down the corridors, greeting each servant by name. He remembered them, not ministers, not generals, but people. And when he died in 1875, they didn't bury a tyrant or a hero. They buried a man who'd been asked to carry a crown, with hands that were never made to hold it. Ferdinand I of Austria didn't fail. He wasn't mad. He wasn't wicked. He was just misplaced, born into the wrong body in the wrong time on the wrong throne. You still there, Night Owl? Still awake beneath your blankets or wandering through the night with your thoughts? Because next, we leave marble palaces behind and enter a land of frost, fur, and fear, where a ruler bled his country dry and turned the Russian crown into a throne of skulls. Next, we meet a man who danced with demons and wore madness like a crown. You're still awake. Or maybe you're somewhere between, that soft, drifting place where the voice blurs and time folds in on itself. You've walked beside kings and queens, watched empires rise and fall like tides beneath a blood moon, and still you stay. So take another breath. Let the dark wrap around you, because now we descend into the icy heart of Russia, where snow fell like ash, where silence wasn't peace but terror, where the Tsar's gaze could mean death. Tonight, we walk beside a child born into power and trauma, a boy who watched his mother die of poison, who grew up in halls colder than any winter, a boy who became a beast. This is the story of Ivan IV of Russia, the one they called the Terrible. But first, understand this. He was not born terrible. He was made. Ivan was only 3 when his father, Grand Prince Vasily III, died. His mother, Elena Glinskaya, became regent. For a brief moment, the boy was safe, loved, protected. Then she was gone, poisoned by nobles who feared her influence. The court turned dark, and the child prince, he became a pawn, raised not by family, but by scheming boyars who fought over him like wolves around a carcass. They beat him, neglected him, sometimes starved him, only to toss scraps at his feet in the cold stone halls of the Kremlin. So Ivan did what children do. He watched, he remembered, and slowly, he hardened. At age 16, he was crowned Tsar of all the Russias, the first to take that title, the first to claim divine authority over an empire. And for a time, he ruled well. He reformed the military, codified laws, crushed corruption, built churches. He even loved. He married Anastasia Romanovna. Gentle, beautiful, patient. They say she was the only person who could soothe his storms, the only one he trusted. But trust is fragile, and nothing in Ivan's life ever stayed unbroken. In 1560, Anastasia fell ill. She died in days. Poison again, the court whispered. And something inside Ivan snapped. He wept for her, raged, collapsed at her tomb, then rose a changed man, a darker man. A Tsar no longer content to punish enemies, but determined to eradicate them. He created the Oprichnina, a state within a state, a black-robed secret police loyal only to him. They rode black horses, carried severed dog heads on their saddles to sniff out treason. They stormed towns, burned homes, executed entire families. He accused nobles of conspiracy, then watched as they were dismembered in public squares. Children were slaughtered alongside parents, monasteries sacked, villages razed. He ruled by terror, and he thrived in it. In 1570, Ivan turned his wrath on his own people. He believed the city of Novgorod plotted against him, so he marched there with his black-cloaked death squads. For 5 straight weeks, they tortured, drowned entire families in the frozen Volkhov River, flung babies against the cathedral walls, turned holy places into charnel houses. The snow turned red, and the screams didn't stop until Ivan said they could. They called him mad, but no one said it aloud. He still went to church, still prayed, still fasted on holy days. But his eyes, they never softened. And then there was the moment that shattered what little soul he had left. It was 1581. a fury over his pregnant daughter-in-law, whom he accused of being immodest. He beat her, and she miscarried. His son, the Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich, confronted him, yelled, defended his wife, stood his ground, and the Tsar, shaking with rage, struck his own son across the temple with a staff. The boy collapsed, blood pooling beneath him. He died days later. Ivan cradled the body, sobbing, wailing, kissing the corpse's face. "I have killed my son," he whispered again and again. "I have killed my heir." He never recovered. The fire inside him didn't die, but it dimmed, burned inward. He aged quickly, spent hours alone in silence, speaking only to ghosts. He died in 1584, slumped in his study chair, playing chess with a noble who wouldn't look him in the eyes. And when they found him, no fanfare, no glory, just the stiff, cold body of a man who had ruled with blood and died with none left to spill. Some say his ghost still walks the Kremlin, eyes sunken, lips mouthing prayers in a tongue long forgotten. Ivan Shkritu, not just terrible, tragic, twisted by grief, warped by power, a monster made, not born. Still with me, Night Owl? Because the snow won't melt just yet. Not when the next ruler turned even darker, one who danced in palaces drenched in paranoia, and left behind a dynasty, drenched in blood. Next, we meet the man whose paranoia swallowed an empire whole, and whose secret police made Ivans look like amateurs. Get ready for a descent into the steel-laced corridors of the 20th century. 'Cause not all tyrants wear crowns. Some wear suits. You made it, part 11. And if you're still here, then you're not just a listener. You're a traveler, willing to walk through centuries of shadow, to witness what the world would rather forget. So dim the lights again, let the silence stretch, and listen closely, because now we enter the 20th century. Not the distant past, but something far more unsettling, because the echoes of this story still linger, in basements, in books, and in the bloodlines of the frightened. We're not in the age of knights or czars anymore. No, we're in the Soviet Union, and standing at the heart of this iron colossus is a man so feared, his name could freeze conversation mid-sentence. So brutal, his very silence could order death. Joseph Stalin, the man of steel, but like iron, he was cold, heavy, forged in fire, and always, always sharp. Yet he wasn't born a god of terror. He was born in Gori, Georgia, in a wooden shack stained by poverty and pain. His real name? Yosip Vissarionis Zayugashvili, a cobbler's son, a boy beaten so severely by his alcoholic father. He once collapsed in a pool of his own blood and learned early that mercy was for the weak. He was clever, too clever, enrolled in a seminary and meant to become a priest. But the only scriptures that captured his soul were those inked by Marx, Engels, and revolution. By 20, he had vanished into the underworld of radical politics, robbing banks, organizing strikes, printing illegal newspapers. Arrested, beaten, exiled, over and over. But like a shadow, he always returned. Harder, quieter, more patient. Then came 1917. The revolution exploded. The Tsar was gone. Lenin rose, and Stalin. He waited, listened, chose silence over spectacle. He was not charismatic like Trotsky, not a fiery orator, but he knew power, knew how to wait for it, how to kill for it. When Lenin died in 1924, he left no clear heir, just a warning. A letter saying Stalin was dangerous, unfit, cruel. Stalin made sure that letter disappeared. And that Trotsky? He disappeared too. First from office, then from Russia, then from this earth entirely. Assassinated with an ice pick in Mexico, ordered by the man he once called comrade. From there, Stalin's rise was absolute. He reshaped the Soviet Union with fire and fear. He industrialized at an impossible pace. Factories rose, dams were built, trains rolled like thunder across the tundra. But beneath it all, the machine ran on bones. Millions died, peasants forced from their land, as collectivization turned fertile soil into fields of famine. Ukraine starved. Men, women, children. Their bodies lining the roads like scarecrows who never stood. They called it the Holodomor. Death by hunger. And Stalin? He said nothing. Denied it ever happened. He spoke of progress. while corpses were counted in silence. But that was only the beginning, because what came next was the Great Purge. Imagine this. You're a teacher, a poet, a general, a clerk. You've done nothing wrong. But one day, you hear a knock at the door. Midnight. Soft, relentless. You open it. There are men in black leather coats. They say your name. No explanation. You disappear. Some were shot that night. Others were dragged to gulags. Freezing camps in Siberia, where men worked until their lungs cracked and their hearts gave up. No trial, no defense, just whispers. Your wife, taken next. Your children, they grow up labeled enemy spawn, marked forever. By the end of it, nearly 1 million were executed, millions more imprisoned, entire generations wiped out. Because Stalin dreamed of control so total, he had to murder even the idea of dissent. Even his own men weren't safe. Men who had fought beside him in the revolution stood in show trials, accused, humiliated, then taken out behind the courthouse and shot. One of them, Bukharin, wrote a letter to Stalin before his execution. It said, "Let your heart now so frozen grow warm again." But Stalin had no warmth left. Only ice, only silence. And yet, the world adored him, or pretended to. Foreign journalists praised the Soviet miracle. Visitors were shown clean cities, smiling children. A parade of perfect workers, all staged, all false. Just outside those cities, there were mass graves waiting to be discovered. And still, the fear kept growing. Stalin trusted no one, not even his doctors, not even his family. He would dine late into the night, with his inner circle, force them to drink, until they stumbled, wept, said something foolish. Then he would have them arrested the next morning. It wasn't just tyranny. It was theater, a play of paranoia, in which Stalin always played God. But even gods die. March 1953. Stalin collapsed in his dacha, alone on the floor, unconscious, soaking in his own urine for hours, before anyone dared enter. Even then, his guards waited, too afraid to open the door, too afraid he might wake and accuse them of betrayal. By the time doctors were called, it was too late. He died as he ruled, alone, feared, surrounded by trembling silence. The man of steel, reduced to dust, but his shadow never left. It lingers in the walls of old apartments, in the prison camps still buried beneath Russian soil, in the wary glances of those who remember what it was to live when a whisper could be your final act. Are you still with me, Night Owl? Still breathing? Still awake? Because from the frost-bitten halls of the Kremlin, we next sail west, into decadence, into madness of a different kind, a palace of mirrors, a nation of masks, where tyranny wore lace and powder, instead of uniforms and blood. The story of an empire, on the eve of revolution, and a queen, who never saw the blade coming. We're going to Versailles, and her name was Marie. Welcome back, Night Owl. Still with me? Good. Because what comes next is not a storm, but the slow, velvet crush before the thunder. Take a breath. Light a candle if you have one. Let the flame dance. Because we're entering a world of mirrors now. A world where illusion was survival, and extravagance disguised decay. Versailles, a palace that glittered like a dream, and rotted like a secret. This was France in the 18th century, a country poised on the edge of revelation and ruin, and at its center, drifting like a swan across marble floors and gilded halls, was a woman whose name would echo long after her head fell. Marie Antoinette. She did not begin as a villain. She began as a girl, 15th child of an Austrian empress, a pawn like so many princesses, in a game played by men in powdered wigs. She was just 14 when she was betrothed to Louis Auguste, the Dauphin of France, a stranger, a boy king in waiting with a soft heart and a quieter will. They married by proxy, with a doll standing in for the groom. And when Marie arrived in France, the first thing they did was strip her. Every stitch of Austrian clothing removed. They replaced her wardrobe, her attendants, even her pets. "You are French now," they said, as if that erased the rest. At Versailles, Marie was greeted with applause and suspicion. She was beautiful, graceful, a foreigner, and worse, a woman. The court adored her youth at first. The way her laugh rang like a bell through the salons, the way she danced until dawn, sprinkled rosewater on her handkerchiefs, and wore sky-colored silks that shimmered like hope. But behind every smile, there were whispers. Why hasn't she produced an heir? Why does she spend so much? Why doesn't she speak French more fluently? Why does she ride horses like a man? She was called frivolous, wasteful, detached, and maybe she was, because Marie was playing a part. In a palace that expected perfection, a golden cage, where every gesture was examined, and every misstep became gossip, and every moment of joy was twisted into sin, so she retreated, into clothes, into gardens, into laughter, and long nights of masked balls and theater. She created a private world, Le Petit Trianon, where peasants were actors and reality was dressed in lace. But while Marie played milkmaid, France starved. Outside Versailles, the streets were swelling with hunger. Bread was scarce. Hope scarcer still. And then came the pamphlets, dark printed poison. They called her Madame Deficit, claimed she bathed in milk, while mothers buried their children. Lies, many of them. But truth doesn't always matter in revolution. And when Louis finally became king, the burden only deepened. He was kind, earnest, timid, and he loved her. But love in the face of history is not enough. Their court spiraled into excess, while the country's coffers ran dry. War with Britain had drained the treasury. Taxes crushed the poor. The nobility remained untouchable, and so the people began to murmur, then scream, Liberté, égalité, fraternité. They wanted bread, they wanted justice, they wanted blood, and they looked to Versailles. In 1789, the gates were stormed. Women marched on the palace, not soldiers but mothers, armed with kitchen knives in fury. They broke into her chambers, killed her guards, dragged the royal family back to Paris, like prisoners in a parade of fury. Marie sat in a carriage, her powdered hair askew, her children beside her, as the mob chanted for her death. But even then, even when the world collapsed around her, she held her head high. She had known all her life how to play a role. Now she played martyr. As the revolution spiraled, as the king was deposed, as the monarchy fell, Marie became the symbol of everything they hated. The decadence, the privilege, the ignorance. In prison, she wore black, mourned the death of her husband, executed by guillotine in January 1793. They took her son from her daughter too. Alone she waited. On October 16th, 1793, they came for her. She dressed carefully, white dress, no jewelry, no adornment. She climbed into the cart, no longer a queen, just a prisoner marked for death. The streets were packed, children perched on rooftops, vendors sold wine. It was a festival of vengeance. When she stumbled on the scaffold, she accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot. "Pardon me, sir," she said quietly. "I didn't mean to do it." Then the blade fell, and the world moved on. But Marie's story never truly ended, because history doesn't forget its ghosts. It rewrites them, repaints them, argues over them. Was she a villain, a victim, a symbol? Or was she simply a girl, born into a world that demanded perfection and punished anything less? You decide, Night Owl, because next we return to darker lands, where power was madness, and madness wore a crown. A castle in Romania, a man whose name became legend, and whose appetite for fear made him immortal. They called him Vlad, but you know him by another name. Welcome back, Night Owl. The air is colder now, isn't it? If you've got a blanket, pull it close. And if your room is still, maybe crack the window. Let a whisper of wind in. It might help you feel what comes next. 'Cause we've stepped beyond the gilded palaces now, beyond pearls and powdered wigs. Now we enter stone, shadow, silence, the kind that lives in the crevices of ruined towers, and the echo of boots on cold dungeon floors. Romania, the 15th century, a land soaked in blood and faith, and the tangled smoke of war, and at its heart, a prince, Vlad the son of the dragon. You might know him by another name, Dracula, but he was not born a monster. He was made. His father, Vlad II, was inducted into a Christian military order, the Order of the Dragon, sworn to defend Europe from the Ottoman Empire. They gave him the title Dracul, the dragon, and so his son became Draculea, the son of the dragon. But the dragon's world was full of fire. Wallachia, Vlad's homeland, was a borderland of blood, caught between two giants, Hungary in the west and the Ottoman Empire in the east. It was a place of betrayal, of shifting allegiances, where a prince might reign for a year, a week, a day, before being exiled, imprisoned, or killed. And Vlad was sent away. As a boy, he and his younger brother Radu were taken as political hostages by the Ottomans. It was meant to guarantee their father's loyalty. A leash, disguised as diplomacy. And so Vlad grew up in enemy hands, in the Sultan's court, surrounded by silk and steel and suspicion, learning their language, their customs, their punishments. He watched what happened to those who disobeyed. He saw the floggings, the impalements, the quiet, systematic breaking of will, and something in him hardened. His brother Radu adapted, charmed, survived. But Vlad, he seethed. Years passed. Then news arrived. His father, Vlad Dracul, was murdered. His older brother, Mircea, tortured and buried alive. All of it, arranged by Wallachian nobles. The very men who should have been loyal. Vlad returned, not as a son, but as a storm. He clawed his way to the throne, gathering allies, trading favors, spilling blood. And when he ruled with terror. His message was simple: loyalty or death. But not just death. Impalement. Vlad had learned it from the Ottomans. A long, sharpened stake, driven up through the body, slowly, deliberately, until the victim was skewered, alive, and left to writhe in agony for hours, even days. He used it not just as punishment, but as theater. He impaled thieves, nobles who betrayed him, foreign invaders, entire villages, and he displayed them, hundreds of rotting bodies, lining the roads into Wallachia, like grotesque sentinels, a forest of corpses that whispered, "This land belongs to Vlad." Did it work? In part, yes. Crime dropped. Corruption slowed. Enemies hesitated. But so did the soul of the nation. And what of his people? They feared him. They obeyed him. Some revered him. But behind closed doors, they called him Tsepesh, the Impaler. There is a story, maybe myth, maybe not, that once Vlad placed a golden cup on the edge of a public fountain in Târgoviște. No guards, no warnings, and no one dared steal it. That's how deeply fear had rooted itself into the skin of his country. But power gained through fear is fragile. Vlad's enemies were many. The Ottomans, the Hungarian king, his own brother Radu, now allied with the Sultan, charming and deadly. They came for him, again and again, and Vlad fought them like a beast cornered in the dark. In 1462, the Ottomans invaded Wallachia, with an army said to number in the hundreds of thousands. Vlad could not face them head-on, so he turned to terror once more. He scorched the land, poisoned the wells, released plague victims into enemy camps, and then, outside the city of Târgoviște, he left them a gift, a field of the dead, 20,000 corpses, impaled, rotting, an open graveyard, meant to break the will of even the most hardened soldiers. The Sultan's army looked upon the scene and turned back. But terror is a currency that loses value, and allies do not forget betrayal. In time, Vlad was captured, imprisoned, replaced. He would return once more, briefly. He died in battle in 1476. His head was taken to Constantinople, presented to the Sultan as proof, the dragon's son, no longer breathing fire, and yet centuries later, his name still coils in our minds. Vlad Dracula, the Impaler, not just a man, but a legend. He was not a vampire, not in truth, but he drank from the fear of men, and sometimes that's worse. So sleep lightly tonight, night owl, 'cause next we leave the myths and return to the madness of kings, to a monarch who painted with blood, who danced with death, who ruled a land of ice and screams. His name was Ivan, and they called him the Terrible. For 5 weeks, his men murdered indiscriminately, men, women, children, bludgeoned, stabbed, drowned beneath the frozen Volkhov River. Some were roasted alive, some buried in pits of snow. It was not just revenge, it was performance. And Ivan watched it all, unblinking. He would pray for the souls of the dead, then order more killings. He saw himself as both judge and priest, executioner and confessor. But what happens when a man crowned by God starts to believe he is God? He turned on his own blood. In a rage, some say a moment of madness, others a calculated cruelty. He struck his son, Ivan Ivanovich. The Tsarevich, his heir, struck him across the head with a heavy scepter. During a violent argument, the young man collapsed, his skull broken, his blood pooling onto the palace floor. And when Ivan realized what he had done, he wept. He held his dying son in his arms, screamed, begged. But it was too late. The image is burned into history. Ivan, bearded and broken, cradling his dead son, the only one who could have inherited the empire of pain he had built. He was never the same after that. He grew more erratic, more paranoid. He bathed in confession, fasted for weeks, then ordered mass executions, and all of Russia held its breath. For decades, when he died in 1584, playing chess in his chambers, they say his face froze in a grimace. No peace, not even in death. And the land he left behind, shattered, leaderless, tumbling into what would be called the time of troubles. It took Russia a generation to crawl from that grave. But his legend never died. Ivan Grozny, the Tsar who crowned himself and unmade the world around him. Tonight, as you close your eyes, remember, true horror is not always found in monsters, but in men who believe they're chosen, men who see betrayal in every shadow, and justice in every act of cruelty. And as we drift onward, we come to another kingdom built on fear, a court of gold and iron masks, of whispering halls and unspeakable violence. Where next? We meet a Sun King, but not the one you're thinking of. No, this one burned from the inside out and dragged a kingdom into his fire. Welcome back, Night Owl. Still with me? If you've made it this far, you've already walked through fire, ice, and madness. You've stood in the shadows of kings who ruled with trembling hands, or iron fists, or fractured minds. But now, as our journey draws to a close, let's light one final candle and turn our eyes to a palace, not cloaked in fog or frost, but glittering with gold. Yet beneath its brilliance, a dark sickness brewed. This is the last portrait, a monarch whose image was so carefully crafted, so obsessively curated, that it became a prison. He could never escape, and it begins in Versailles, a kingdom of mirrors, of marble, of silence dressed in silk. This is the world of Louis XIV, the Sun King. But this is not his story. No, tonight we follow his descendant, a pale and bloated echo of that golden legacy. We end with Louis XVI, the king, who ruled as the world changed, too fast for his blood to follow. He was not born to be a monster. He was not born cruel. But sometimes history doesn't demand villains, only absences. And Louis XVI was an absence made flesh. He came to power in 1774, young, awkward, shy. He preferred locksmithing to politics, books to banquets, quiet over command. And beside him, Marie Antoinette, a teenage girl sent across borders, draped in foreign silks, married into a palace that hated her. Before she even spoke, they were children, both of them, trapped in a theater, older than they could comprehend. Versailles was rotting from the inside. The nobles still danced, the courtiers still flattered, but the air was heavy with debts, with bread riots, with whispers carried from Paris. On the cold wind, the people were starving, and the palace was feasting. It wasn't that Louis was blind. He saw it. He heard the rumors, the unrest. But every decision he made was too slow, too soft. Too late, he tried reforms. He tried taxes. He tried appeasement. But he was a king, out of rhythm with his age. And the world does not wait for kings to catch up. The Bastille fell, and with it, the illusion of untouchable monarchy. Paris rose like a storm tide, tearing down the old world, brick by brick. And Louis, He hesitated. While others fled or fought, he wrote in his journal. Often just one word. Rien. Nothing. Even as the tide reached the gates, he tried to maintain ceremony. He still expected deference from a people whose children were eating rats. Then the fateful attempt to escape. June 1791, Louis and his family, dressed in disguise, crept through the palace into the night, hoping to flee to Austria. But they were recognized by a village postmaster who had once seen the king's face on a coin. Betrayed by his own image, they were dragged back to Paris in a silent procession. No cheers, just stares. That was the moment. Many said, when the monarchy truly died. From there, it was a slow spiral into the abyss. He was stripped of titles, made a citizen, put on trial for crimes against the people. He stood before the convention, not as a king, but as Louis Capet, and as the verdict rang out, death. He nodded, quietly. January 24, 1793. The sky was a dull gray. The crowd gathered, silent, not in reverence, but in resolve. Louis stepped onto the scaffold at the Place de la Révolution. He tried to speak. People of France, I die innocent. But the drummers rolled, drowning him out. They say he did not scream, that he looked heavenward. As the blade fell, and in that instant, the age of kings collapsed, not with fire, not with war, but with silence and steel. The blood ran into the sawdust, red and glistening, and the people, those same people who had once knelt before his ancestors, did not weep. They turned and walked away, leaving behind the scaffold and the future. The reign of Louis XVI ended not with tyranny, but with tragedy. He was not a madman, not a tyrant, just a man, raised to believe. The sun rose for him, but the sun had long since set, and the world, hungry, angry, awake, no longer bowed to crowns. So now, as your eyes grow heavy and the past begins to fade, remember this: history is not just made by monsters and heroes, but by those who stood still while everything changed. Thank you for walking with me tonight. If you made it to the end, let me know where you listened from, what time it was, what name you'd give the feeling these stories left behind. Till next time, sleep deeply and dream of gentler kings. Of course, here's a cinematic and soothing call to action and outro to close the video, matching the intimate, mysterious tone of your historical documentary. If tonight's journey moved you, even just a little, take a moment to breathe it in. Let the echoes of those ancient halls settle somewhere quiet in your mind. If you're still awake, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from. Drop a comment. What time is it there? And what moment from tonight's story stayed with you the most? If this kind of soft, immersive history speaks to you, you can always subscribe, so you don't miss the next midnight chapter we unfold together. There's always another secret, another forgotten face, another shadow in the timeline, waiting to whisper. And if you're already drifting, good. Let the past hold your thoughts for a little while longer. Let the weight of kings and kingdoms become a lullaby. Thank you for being here. Until next time, dim the lights, rest your mind, and may your dreams be filled with candlelight and silence. Good night, night owl. You are not alone in the dark.